Hey guys, this is Max Steinberg. I'm a partner at SaberSim and a daily fantasy professional. And I'm back from Miami. I'm in California, and I'm here to bring you part 5 and the final installment of my Road to the FFWC video series. And in this part, I'm going to review my lineup, look at some of the top lineups, and then answer some questions that some of you have sent in about my video series, about my process that might have been left unanswered in some of the videos. So I'm going to start with the questions right off the bat. So we got a few questions via email and one via Twitter. So I just wanted to answer them, and then I'll get into reviewing my lineup. So, and I think some of them, these will actually tie into my lineup review, so it'll work out well. So first question. Hello, Max. I have a couple questions for you. Okay, great. I believe you maybe are more of a max entry guy versus single entry. How much different is your process for each of these? Do you think SaberSim strength is more suited for max entry events, or maybe coming closer to 20 max entry versus, say, 1 or 3 entries? And as a final question, being a numbers guy, how often do you find yourself making gut calls that maybe go outside the realm of the numbers or the game script? So I think this is a good question. I think SaberSim obviously is built really well to make a larger amount of lineups. But I think this smart diversity feature is actually perfect when you're making one lineup and you want to sort of give yourself some options based on the projections that you have or some projections that you've made or adjusted off of Sabres. And this is what I did in the Thanksgiving slate where I actually won the seat. Is I only made one entry in the tournament, but that one entry was based off of building a bunch of lineups, looking at them, and then choosing one I liked. And that's because the smart diversity feature, which I talk about in another video, and I highly recommend you finding the smart diversity video on our YouTube page because I describe it in detail, and it's a really, really cool thing that we use in our lineup builder that leverages our simulation data in this very cool way that helps take into account upside of players and basically real outcomes of games that could happen. And if you set this to pi or very high, what will end up happening is you're going to get lineups that are sort of based on like things that are like high range of outcome possibilities. And so that's what these lineups really are. Like obviously the projected score here is some amount, but the Sabre score is sort of taking into account what our builders finding in the simulations of the possible upside of the players, and it's also incorporating correlation and ownership fade. So what I actually did in the morning, which I didn't get into in the video, is I had my build and I got my final build, and I ended up actually just looking over some of these lineups. And one thing I found is I was just getting a lot of Kyler Murray, and I think it was for good reason. He was really cheap. Larry Fitzgerald was really cheap. Christian Kirk was really cheap. Kenyon Drake was really cheap. I thought they were going to do pretty well against this decimated Cleveland defense at home, and they did. And unfortunately, Kyler Murray didn't throw for that many touchdowns, which would have helped. But overall, I was happy with sort of that Arizona stack, given I got so much out of Kenyon Drake. But I actually capped the max exposure to Arizona. If I don't do it, I think I end up getting about 31% Arizona. So you can see scrolling down that there's a lot of Kyler Murray in these lineups. And because of that, I was like, okay, I'm definitely just have to go with Kyler Murray here. Obviously, there's like a Ryan Fitzpatrick one. I thought that was interesting. But given that overwhelming amount, despite the fact my gut initially said, and here's where I'm getting into the gut thing, maybe I'd want to go some other direction, this sort of is showing me, okay, clearly this is the best stack. So then I can just use my gut instinct and say, okay, well, is there one of these that I like more than the other? Because the Sabre score isn't that much different, really. So I think I can use my discretion here a little bit and sort of pick one. But my gut actually said that this was a pretty good lineup. I thought Miles Sanders, I just did not think was going to be high owned, and I liked pairing him with this Eagles D that I like quite a bit. And then I just really liked this game stack. I thought Odell Beckham Jr. also was going to get low ownership, and he did. I mean, if you look at the ownership numbers here, I was one of 2 people who had Miles Sanders, if I'm calculating this correctly, or maybe 3. Kyler Murray's 18%. That's actually kind of high, but, Larry Fitzgerald 7, Odell Beckham Jr. 5. These are really low ownership numbers. So my gut was sort of saying, okay, this does seem like a pretty damn good lineup, and I'm going to keep it. So I think you can use your gut when you're making a single entry. You don't really have to use the top lineup. In fact, if you really set smart diversity to very, very high, you really don't. It sort of is going to be a great way to give yourself sort of a choice of what to do. So I think all in all, you can really use your gut sort of picking the top lineup out of the top 10 or so lineups that SaberSim builds you. I just happen to like this first lineup. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, question number 2. In a relatively small tournament like the championship, does Max use average percentile scores? And for huge GPPs, would he suggest using 85 percentile, since the winning lineup is going to be where all the players are hitting near their ceiling? So he's talking about our percentile projections. And these are essentially based off our simulation data. And, you know, if you want to take into account upside more, you can sort of use these projections, the percentile projections, as your actual projections. And while I think these numbers are helpful, I actually never go above the average. And that's, again, because of the smart diversity feature. If you set it high enough, it's going to take the upside of the players into account. And you really don't need to worry about this. So I suggest, if you really do care about upside, which I think we all do, you can set smart diversity to very, very high. And maybe not the top thing, unless maybe you're doing showdown, but one of these like top two ones. And then you're going to really take into account upside in your lineups. Given it was under an 80-person tournament, I didn't have to care about like that much upside. So I did set smart diversity a little lower. But I think you can, when you want to take into account upside, just set the smart diversity feature to higher, and you'll take that into account. Last question. So this is a question about one of the videos where I talked about the ownership fade slider, which is this thing here. So he says, you had me confused on vid 3 with the ownership fade slider. You said as a contrarian player, you have to set it to low, but I thought low settings didn't fade the high-end players, making sure I'm not misinterpreting its use. Yeah, so let me just get into this a little more. So I said ownership fade to low, and that being said, if you look at my lineup, wow, there's some real low-end plays, right? So what ended up happening is I didn't really, quote unquote, need high ownership fade in order to have a pretty contrarian lineup. And the reason I was talking about in the video how you have to sort of know yourself is because of how basically we project. Because every single DFS player, when they're projecting players, has flawed projections. They're not perfect, right? And so if you're working off completely perfect projections, you just set this number to very, very high, and you could just trust that you're going to spit out, like SaberSim's going to give you really, really good lineups that are perfectly fading ownership, right? But the thing is that our projections aren't perfect. They're going to be very, very flawed. Even mine, like I work very hard on them, and they're very, very flawed. And they're usually flawed, and this is where I'm talking about knowing yourself, in the direction of I favor contrarian plays, and I sort of like intuitively are low on plays that I know are going to be high-owned. And because of that, if I set ownership fade to really high, what happens is I end up sort of doubling that kind of mistake, because what Saber's going to do is going to favor those low-end plays even more, which I'm already doing. So I actually set it to low because I know that I kind of just have the preconceived intention of doing this, and I don't need to do this. And I think a perfect example is Leonard Fournette. Like, I projected him really high. I loved him. And I think part of the reason I loved him is I just thought he was going to be the lower owned play out of Saquon Barkley and Chris Carson. And he really was. I mean, if you look at these lineups, let's see. I'm not sure. So Saquon Barkley, 42% owned. I'm sure there's someone with Chris Carson here is 50% owned. So I sort of was favoring him already. And so, you know, in hindsight, it actually would have been better to get Saquon Barkley because well, he would have done better. But I really didn't need to. If I literally was just choosing between Fournette and Barkley, looking at my lineup and looking at the projected ownership, and if I was projecting more reasonably, I would have just said, okay, I can use Saquon here. It's totally fine, right? I'm so contrarian already. It doesn't matter. And so, but because I'm already projecting kind of like a madman and having Fournette over Saquon Barkley, which in hindsight was a little stupid, setting that ownership fade higher is just going to ensure that I'm just not going to get as much Saquon Barkley as I really should. So that's what I mean by just knowing yourself when using the ownership fade slider. Obviously, it's very good, but you have to make sure that you're not already sort of biased to making projections that are contrarian already. Otherwise, you're just sort of going to make your mistakes worse. So I think that's really important. So here, let's just look at my lineup right now. So this is what I ended up with. And I just want to look at it and see if there's any regrets. I think in terms of my game stack, I really don't have any regrets. I think still in hindsight, this felt like overwhelmingly the best value. And looking at these ownerships, I think there's not really any regrets there. I think Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk and Kyler Murray were low owned enough that seemed like a really, really profitable stack. And if I were to do it all over again, I'd probably keep that. And then Odell Beckham Jr. coming back. He was only 5% owned. I'm not sure if I can find a lineup with Jarvis Landry. I might try to do that fast. Jarvis Landry is 25% owned. So I think in stacking this game, it was really great to get OBJ instead because I ended up being really contrarian there. And I think OBJ, he's a higher ADOT player. He's a player who can get big plays. So I think it makes sense that, Odell Beckham Jr. gets a big score and there's more plays for Kyler Murray and Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. So I think that made sense. And it's not surprising to me that, SaberSim actually gave me an Odell Beckham Jr. Lineup here instead of a Jarvis Landry lineup. So really like that play. And, it worked out fine. I think Odell Beckham Jr. does not look totally healthy, but I'm still fine with that play. I'm okay taking that risk. George Kittle obviously worked out really well. He was just one tight end that I was really fine with. Kenyon Drake also worked out really well. Miles Sanders worked out really well. There's a lot of stuff that worked out really well here. But I think the main thing that's my big regret, which I just touched on earlier, is I really feel like I overprojected Leonard Fournette. And in reality, I think Saquon was probably a 1 or 2 points better than Fournette. I think Chris Carson, I just don't in the long term think he was a better play than Fournette. And because of that, I wish that I would have projected them more reasonably. And it's possible that SaberSim would have given me a Saquon lineup instead of Fournette lineup. And I'm sad it didn't work out that way because I think I would have placed in the top 10 if that was the case. So it's too bad that happened, but this is the type of mistake that I know that I make. So that's why in general I sort of keep that ownership fade low because I usually end up with these contrarian lineups. One thing you also might have noticed on part 4 of my video is I was going to use a Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill stack. And it's really too bad that weather was so bad because I was really on it. And I think in hindsight, I don't regret getting off of it because the weather was really bad. It was really slick. I think passing in general is depressed. And even for Kansas City, I think it was a little depressed. And Tyreek Hill obviously still had a really big game. But I think my analysis was right there. So I'm happy I did get off of it. But it is kind of sad to see that the winning lineup actually had Mahomes and Tyreek Hill because that would have been really, really nice. I don't know that I would have actually ended up with the same lineup because I don't think I would have had Greg Ward or Boston Scott. I probably would have had Chris Conley. But my lineup probably would have been a little different. I don't know if I would have won, but it's a little too bad. But I'm really happy with my process, at least, that I was sort of on that. And I think this lineup in general was interesting. It was a good amount of chalkiness with a non-chalky stack. And I think that's a smart thing to do. I think if you have a quarterback receiver stack in these tournaments, and that quarterback receiver stack is not chalk, I think you can feel pretty safe just going chalk the rest of the way. I think Boston Scott was an interesting play. Philadelphia was going to use a lot of the running backs, and Patriots D obviously was a good play, and ended up kind of under the radar at 4,000. They only got 8% ownership, so I think that was a really savvy play by this guy who's actually a poker player. His name's Mazer Bowie on Twitter. I think his name's Jesse Martin. So congrats to him, Mr. Good Seats. I think this guy's a pro. So I talked about Ty Johnson in part 4. I think he was an interesting play. It did not really work out for Mr. Good Seats, and that's too bad. I think you'd have easily had a 12 to 15-point game, especially given he had 4 receptions. He somehow only had 3 rushing yards because Matt Patricia used this very backup running back from the practice squad. But I think this is a cool lineup as well. This is one that I would have considered Jameis Winston if it weren't for the thumb injury that he was sort of nursing all week. And Mr. Goodseats also got kind of unlucky here too with Chris Godwin getting injured. He might have won this tournament without that. So this might have been like the savviest lineup of the week, really, with Winston and Godwin, bringing it back with Amendola and Ty Johnson. And just a couple things didn't go his way. Otherwise, this could have been the winner. I'm sure he's feeling pretty sad about it, even though he did win $1 million. And then Peter Gibbons. This was interesting, too. So both the top lineups did have Greg Ward, who sort of caught a last-second touchdown and was close to Stoneman, I think. But this one, or he was Stoneman. But this one was a fun sweat given, he had a huge Dallas Rams game stack, and the Rams were keeping their starters in at the end. But he really needed Robert Woods to do something, and that just didn't happen. But otherwise, some really savvy plays here. Kenyon Drake, Saquon Barkley, and Ezekiel Elliott all scored over 30 points. Pretty crazy. Jared Goff just could not get himself to have a big game, but maybe passing a last-second touchdown to Robert Woods would have been different for Peter Gibbons. So congrats to him. And then Osimo bring up the rear. Derek Carr and Darren Waller, I think that makes sense. He also had Ty Johnson. So this actually seemed like sort of the savvy play of some of the good players. I ended up not using him, but I do think he was a good play. And then Julio Jones, that's a really interesting play from Osimo that ended up really working out. Obviously, there's a lot of injuries. He wasn't going to get shouted in this game, and I think he probably had 6 entries, and this was one of the ways he went contrarian. I'm kind of surprised he didn't use, if he was going to use Julio, he didn't use someone like Matt Ryan. But I'm seeing now that Derek Carr was only 5,600, so now that does make sense. But again, some core plays. I mentioned Christian McCaffrey, liking him. I mentioned liking Dan Amendola. Sadly, I only had 1 entry, so I didn't have a lot of variety in my lineups. But these are just all solid plays that people are on. It's just all about making a good game stack, having the right combination, and SaberSim really does that for you. So all in all, it was a really great trip. Miami was beautiful, and I had a great time. I'm happy with my 28th place finish. Wish it was a little better. I was definitely sitting pretty, and after the morning games, having a Miles Sanders Eagles D stack that had 46 points already and having all this late game exposure, but it didn't work out for a top 10 finish, and that's okay. So I really hope you enjoyed this whole video series. I personally really, really enjoyed it, and it was really fun. I hope it let you understand what a professional's process is throughout the week and how it's actually pretty simple, and it's something that there's no secret sauce or anything like that. A lot of the stuff I do is stuff that you can, even my, proprietary models, even my expected fantasy point model, that's something you just find online from someone else. It's really not something that is so secret or whatever. And it's just really all about using SaberSim and honestly just trusting what is popping out, using a little bit of your intuition to pick whatever lineup that you really feel is best and your gut instinct, and then going with it and trusting that your projections are good and trusting that our simulation data is good. So SaberSim is a really cool tool. I really, really recommend it. And luckily for you, we are offering a 3-day free trial. And even if you tried us before, we've wiped the slate clean. So you can actually try us again for free if you want for 3 days. This weekend's a great time. DraftKings has some really big tournaments. FanDuel has some really big tournaments. Really, really recommend trying us out. We have a lot of new features that are really, really cool. And it makes it really easy to make 20, 20 plus lineups and do mass multi-entry, or it's really good for even just picking one lineup like I did here. So I hope you enjoyed this video series. Good luck to you for the rest of the daily fantasy season, and thank you so much for watching.